Imagine opening your phone in the morning. Among dozens of headlines, one immediately catches your attention. A disaster, a crisis, an accident, a threat. And even if you were looking for something completely different, your eyes keep drifting back to that story. What's most interesting is that this happens to almost everyone. Many people claim they prefer positive content. They say they want good news, inspiring stories, and useful information. But when it comes time to choose what to read, watch, or share, negative news often wins. Why? Why can a single alarming headline capture our attention so easily? Are we naturally pessimistic? Is there something wrong with the human mind? In fact, the explanation is much older than the internet, newspapers, or television. It goes back to a time when survival depended on the ability to identify dangers quickly. For thousands of years, ignoring a threat could have fatal consequences. Ignoring good news, on the other hand, rarely put anyone's life at risk. As a result, our brains evolved to treat negative information in a special way, not because we like it, but because it may contain something the brain considers important for survival. And that mechanism is still operating within us today. The issue is that it influences our attention far more than we realize. And it all begins with a psychological tendency so powerful that it shapes the way we see the entire world. If two events happened at the same time in front of our ancestors, which one would deserve more attention? A tree full of fruit, or a strange noise coming from the bushes? From a survival standpoint, the answer was obvious. Ignoring the fruit could mean missing an opportunity. Ignoring a potential threat could mean losing your life. That's why evolution favored brains that were extremely sensitive to signs of danger. Psychologists refer to this mechanism as the negativity bias. In simple terms, negative experiences tend to produce a stronger emotional impact than positive experiences of similar intensity. A criticism tends to stay in memory longer than a compliment. A loss usually weighs more heavily than an equivalent gain. A worrying piece of news attracts more attention than a reassuring one. This doesn't happen because the brain is flawed. It happens because it was shaped to prioritize information that may represent risk. For a human ancestor, paying too much attention to a threat that didn't exist was inconvenient. But ignoring a real threat could be fatal. Over thousands of generations, natural selection favored those who erred on the side of caution. And that psychological inheritance is still alive today. Even if you are sitting safely on your couch at home, a headline about a crisis, a disaster, or a distant danger can activate mental systems that evolved to deal with immediate threats. But there is an unexpected side effect. The more attention we give to negative news, the harder it becomes to stop consuming it. And that is where a cycle begins, one that traps millions of people every day. If negative news makes us worried, anxious, or uncomfortable, why do we keep consuming more of it? At first glance, that seems contradictory. But to the brain, it makes perfect sense. When a piece of information suggests a possible threat, the mind does not consider its job finished once it becomes aware of it. Quite the opposite. It begins to monitor it. It's as if a part of the brain says, "This could be important. Keep watching." So you read one news story. Then you look for an update. Next, you watch a video about the topic. Later, you check again to see if anything has changed. Without realizing it, you've entered a cycle of vigilance. The problem is that many modern threats have no clear resolution. An economic crisis, an international conflict, an epidemic, political changes. These are complex situations that can last for months or even years. Yet the brain keeps searching for new information, as if it were trying to pinpoint the exact moment when the danger will disappear. But that moment rarely comes. And that is why so many people end up consuming enormous amounts of news without feeling safer or better informed. In fact, the opposite often happens. The more negative information they absorb, the greater the number of threats around them seems to be. And this creates a powerful illusion, an illusion that can profoundly change the way we see the world. Because there is a huge difference between what happens frequently and what we can remember easily. Imagine two people living in the same city. The first spends only a few minutes a day following the news. The second spends hours consuming headlines, videos, debates, and updates about crimes, crises, conflicts, and disasters. Which one is more likely to feel that they live in a dangerous world? In most cases, the second person. Not necessarily because they have a better understanding of reality, but because their brain has been exposed to a much larger number of negative examples. The human mind relies on a simple mental shortcut. When trying to estimate how often something happens or how likely it is to occur, it tends to base its judgment on how easily it can recall examples. If news about violence appears in front of you every day, those examples become highly accessible in memory. And when something is easy to remember, the brain tends to conclude that it is common. The result is a distorted perception of reality. Even when statistics show improvements in certain areas, many people continue to believe that everything is getting worse. Not because they are ignoring the facts, but because their minds are being constantly fed highly memorable negative information. This phenomenon affects more than just perceptions of safety. It influences expectations, decisions, and even mood. The more threats we perceive around us, the more stressful the world seems. But there is another reason why so many negative stories are competing for your attention. And that reason has less to do with psychology and more to do with money. If negative news attracts more attention, what happens in a world where attention has become one of the most valuable resources? It receives more and more prominence. Newspapers, broadcasters, websites, and digital platforms are constantly competing for clicks, views, and time spent on their content. And in that environment, attention functions like a currency. The problem is that the human brain does not distribute that attention evenly. As we've seen, threats, risks, and dangers trigger immediate interest. That's why alarming headlines tend to generate more curiosity than reassuring ones. Not necessarily because there is a conspiracy, but because there is a powerful incentive. If a negative story captures more attention, it tends to receive more clicks. If it receives more clicks, it tends to be promoted more heavily. And if it is promoted more heavily, more people see it. The same thing happens with social media algorithms and video platforms. They quickly learn which types of content keep people engaged. And content that evokes fear, concern, outrage, or urgency often does this very effectively. The result is an environment where negative information gains disproportionate visibility. But here is the important part. The fact that your brain pays attention to threats does not mean you are obligated to follow that impulse all the time. Because understanding the mechanism is the first step towards seeing what is really happening. And that brings us to the final revelation. So why can't you ignore bad news? The answer is not that you are pessimistic, nor is it that there is something wrong with your mind. In fact, the issue is exactly the opposite. Your brain is functioning the way it was designed to function. For thousands of years, paying attention to potential threats increased the chances of survival. Ignoring a real danger could have serious consequences. That is why evolution favored brains that gave priority to negative information, risks, and warning signs. This mechanism was extremely useful for our ancestors. But the world has changed. Today, a person can be exposed to hundreds of potential threats in just a few minutes. Economic crises, international conflicts, natural disasters, health concerns, scandals, accidents. Most of these events do not represent an immediate danger to the person watching them. But the brain does not always make that distinction efficiently. It continues to react as though every new threat deserves urgent attention. And that is why so many people become trapped in a cycle of worry, vigilance, and constant consumption of negative news. The paradox is that the very mechanism that helped our species survive can, in the modern world, increase anxiety, stress, and feelings of insecurity. Perhaps the answer is not to completely ignore bad news. It has value. It can inform, warn, and prepare us. The real challenge is recognizing that your brain has been programmed to give it far more weight than it necessarily deserves. Because there is an important difference between being informed about the dangers of the world and seeing only the dangers of the world. And perhaps the next time a negative headline immediately captures your attention, the most useful question will not be, "How dangerous is this?" but rather, "Is my brain reacting to reality or simply to a survival instinct that dates back thousands of years?"